Okay, so I'll make sure that some of the slides keep you awake, and by the time we are ready with some excitement for tea. So I'm going to talk about assessment reforms, but since it's a master class, we are also trying to maybe do a few things together. Ideal would have been to really sit and make questions together, but that was slightly difficult. So I've put some questions. We are going to sort of put our thoughts together, analyze some of them, look at some data, and understand how a question is made. I come from an organization, Educational Initiatives. I think yesterday many of you would have heard Sridhar. And all we love is questions. So there are 10 minutes for questions for me also. But during the presentation also, you will see me showing a lot of questions, the questions that we keep creating. I think that's what we do. We just make questions most of the times. And then we go and reanalyze our questions and understand how these questions can be made better. So I want to show some cases where we've struggled, failed, and how we improvise on some of those questions. So broadly, the agenda of the presentation will have a few things where I think during these 2 days, a lot of things have been discussed. So I'll quickly touch upon the need for assessment and stuff like that. We will spend some time on looking at questions, why multiple choice questions are a preferred mode of questions in large scale assessments, how they are designed typically within EI, how we approach it. How do we use data on each distractor to understand misconceptions? At the fourth point, I want to go and talk about the AP project that Sridhar had briefly touched upon yesterday. I want to just highlight that as an ongoing assessment reform and the parts that we are playing there, along with LFE is one of our partners there. And then we will quickly focus on the future of assessments and how it's going to look like in future. So that's the agenda. We have dedicated time towards the end for questions, but I've been a teacher for the longest period of my time. So if you just feel that urge to ask a question, just ask and I'll be happy to take those questions as well. Okay. I think we've spoken about this enough, so this makes my life easy. We all agree that assessments are needed. It wasn't the case around before 10, 15 years, and whenever we went to a state and approached and proposed an idea of a third-party assessment, there was a lot of resistance faced, right? Generally, what you end up hearing is, you do not understand our children, how would you assess them? That was the first resistance that we encountered. From there to now, of course, through NEP, multiple dialogues, assessments like ASAR that happen year on year and they show that there is less change that is being observed. There is some amount of openness towards assessments being done by third party. Through NEP and through multiple initiatives like STARS projects of World Bank, now there is a budget allocation also happening for assessments. Now, when we look at assessments, assessments again can be understanding an intervention's impact versus working with a state at a scale. And when you work with a state at a scale, everything that we've discussed from this morning is applicable, right? For me to do assessment of, say, 10,000 children is one matter, but working in a state machinery and making that possible is another matter. So towards the case study part, we will try and see how that plays out when you work with a state like Andhra Pradesh and what are general challenges that we observe. So everyone is talking about assessments and everyone does assessments now. They're happening, third-party assessments happen. Even states have item banks, state assessment cell. But when you get deeper into it, you realize that the questions are still very simple, memory-based, rote learning driven. Questions that often check for a simple concept, not necessarily a conceptual clarity and full understanding of that concept. There are questions that are often not questions that check for application or integration of multiple concepts to arrive at a question. Right, so on the left-hand side of the screen, you see all the questions that you typically see in the papers. And there's an example from PISA paper that has been put as a good question example here. And if you just spend 10 seconds reading the question, you will realize that for me to answer an application-based higher order question, the first skill that I will need is, what is the first and foremost skill that I would need for a question like PISA that you see on the screen? Sorry? Reading and comprehension becomes the first thing. And I think generally whenever we try and put such questions out, the first resistance is, as such reading levels are low, how do you ask for complex questions? If you overcome that comprehension issue, what's so special about this question? Can someone help me arrive at an answer? Which type of questions do you like and why? You want a mic? Yeah.
Question on the right side,
Question on the right side is better. Why do you think
because
so?
it has visual understanding and we can imagine better when we are given question in that form.
Right.
So
It has visual support. It has question that has lot of details. If you see, there are multiple scientific and physical concepts getting covered in one question. I am not asking what is soil erosion, that is getting tested. I am not asking what is the role of soil and sunlight and types of vegetation, but that is getting tested. Unless I understand all these things and apply it in a real life scenario, my ability to answer this question correctly is going to be low, versus what I see on my left side is like very micro concepts that if I just remember out of my memory, I can answer. So for any assessment agency to come out and say the learning levels are there, if I use questions that I see on my left side, I may end up inflating the actual learning levels. I may end up saying students are at learning levels, while if you test them on and similar questions like PISA, you will not find that, right? So one, while assessment, understanding, awareness, need, those things are being felt, the focus on how assessments can become better is still fully not there. So we are all trying to sort of drive this in our own ways, and some of the very core principles of how a good assessment can be designed are still required to be emphasized upon. Yeah. So now, because we have NEP, it talks about assessments very clearly. Many of you must be aware of Parak that is coming up, right? And if you go back to NEP, it highlights certain things which typically EI's question also try and take care of. Is when you assess your question shouldn't be just assessment of facts, but also skills. Your advanced question actually should be an integration of multiple skills. You should focus on grades which are lower grades. So there are two ways of approaching assessments. Again, going back to Sridhar has spoken about it. The moment I start assessing younger children, I have more time to reform and bring them to their learning levels. Moment I start from board reforms, I have more opportunities to influence the whole system, because when I was in 10th, I was told, पिछले 3 साल के papers कर लो, you will get 80% marks, right? So that's how we have trained ourselves, that if you practice previous year's papers, really by and large from that same pool, you will keep on getting questions and you can answer those questions. So most of us, at least I experience that. So changing that becomes an important thing. I'm not talking about the progress card because that's something at least our work does not focus on, but that's a very important part in NEP as well. I am pressing the wrong side. Yeah. Now comes the bigger question. I have to do assessment for 30 children in my classroom. I can do it. I can design an assessment and arrive at an answer. I know my 30 children very well. I know which kind of paper will work for them. Imagine yourself in a board assessments team or designing an assessment for a state. Will your approach change? Should it change? Should it not change? And why? Sorry? Context is important. Can you elaborate a bit on that? So that context you're saying is important. Okay, what else will you keep in mind? Will you change the rigor of the paper? Yes? And why? Right.
But when I'll going statewide, I need to just check the health of the program,
Right.
and so I'll mostly I'll not test each and every child. I will need to do sampling,
Right.
and I'll need to reduce the rigor of the question, because I need to test, train my assessors, and I need to maintain the means consistency in the test, reporting of the observations.
Okay, any contradictory answer to that? Hmm. Can you elaborate on the meaning of scaffolding for you, for the crowd? Yeah. Yeah. Types of questions. Okay. So we've heard two things, right? One, of course, I can't test all the children every time. Assessment bada महंगा होता है, by the way. Third party assessments are expensive. So as state, when I'm looking at it, I also have to look at expenditure that I'm making. In fact, we're working with one state, and we'll talk about their assessments, but they spend like tens of crores in just printing the papers. And that's why I'll come to the fifth point, why digital is an important thing. So the amount of investments, and we are still not talking about manpower, we are just talking about one piece of cost, which is printing, is going to be very high. So you will have to definitely sample children out. That is something there. You also want to make sure that the paper is relevant to everyone. So intuitively, जितने भी teachers हैं, मैं भी जैसे when I came to EI, my first reaction was paper easy कर देते हैं, क्योंकि सब बच्चों को आना चाहिए. But moment I do that, I will never have the real benchmark. So I have been trying to lose weight. And the only way I can lose weight is by actually monitoring my weight and knowing that I am overweight by X kgs, X number of kgs, right? So for me to, rather than bringing down the benchmark, actually putting out the facts at the right level becomes more relevant. And that's why overall rigor of the paper still should be managed. But what you can do is, because you have very heterogeneous set of children, can you have items from lower grades also, maintain high rigor for those items too, and take that forward? That's what we will see. But for assessments to become also more of an information to the state, because while we are assessing children, we are not passing a judgment on the child's learning level. The idea is that through that data, we go back and tell the state to do certain reforms. It's a diagnostic nature, right? I go and say, these things are working, these are not working, this is what you need to work on. And to do that, I think two or three areas become crucial in the whole K-12 space. First is to start with FLN assessments. I think enough has been spoken about it, so I'm not going to repeat it. But the purpose of doing FLN assessments is basically to ensure that children from the early on are at a certain learning pace. And we will see another graph where we will see that if in the first 3 years children don't pick up these basic skills, their overall ability, their overall learnability goes down. So one is providing FLN support, both in terms of assessments and learning. Second, I think we've discussed about board reforms, the goal post, right? 10th important है, 12th important है, फर्क आएगा शायद 5th and 8th भी important हो जाएगा if those become centralized assessments. But if we start focusing on those assessments, for states to respond to anything that is more of a goal post is easier. So if we try and focus and change quality of board papers, that can also somewhere trickle down. And the whole teaching to the test, see, teaching to the test is not going to change overnight. We all will probably, as teachers, we want our children to do better on certain exams. But can we use that concept of teaching to the test to focus on learning? So moment I focus on my 10th, 12th board exams and make those questions better, again, I'm reflecting and giving more opportunities for children to learn. The third point is the point which we'll talk about multiple times. Assessments at scale can work, but the effects will be visible only after a few years. So if for anything at scale, of course, but especially in state systems where there are multiple variables, First couple of years may just feel like nothing is working, nothing is showing, my intervention is not working, because the scale at which you work, both in terms of assessments and the intervention, is going to take its time. So that patience and the whole discussion in the morning about a continuity of the bureaucratic structures to support becomes a crucial factor in the state scenario. Is the pace okay? Information okay? Anything? Yeah? Perfect. Okay. I think I've already spoken about this slide, but one, assessments, the bare minimum that they do is they give you a report card for each child, right? Even in a large scale assessment, it can provide child wise scorecard. That's the minimum thing. But when you think of large scale assessments, what you're also doing is you're trying to see at the systemic level, at the state level, what is the overall learning level, what are the gaps. Again, you can segregate these into starting from school to district to mandals to whatever categories, and you can have those cutoffs in your data. And that goes back as information saying these are the areas where your children are doing well, these are the areas where you need to work on. And when you say these are the weak areas, it's not always classroom instruction that needs to change. So there are multiple things that you can do. After we give assessment report, often with assessment report, we also try and study the textbooks. And often we find that some of the misconceptions that seep in, that children sort of pick up, are because the way textbook chapters are written. Okay, for the longest period of time, photosynthesis in my mind was plant taking carbon dioxide and giving out oxygen, not realizing at night plants do respiration, because that was not explicitly called out in the books that I studied. It's only probably in my graduation where I started studying photosynthesis as probably one big chapter I realized, right? My misconceptions weren't caught because I was answering regular questions. But moment you start asking questions which capture these gaps, the textbooks also can become better. So assessments, of course, will give you learning outcome and measures. It can also inform the state on multiple different initiatives that the state can take. And third thing is, once the assessments start showing these gaps, there is a good chunk of time, money, resources, energy invested by SCRT on teacher training. Okay, but if you go and study those teacher trainings, the focus on assessment related teacher trainings is really, really low. So our aim, EI's aim, is to somewhere bring capacity building of assessments to the central concept, where all the SCRD trainings also have a component on training teachers on how to create good questions. And that's a hope that somewhere that will influence the capacity building too. Yeah, I'm going to skip this slide. This is more of a visual presentation of all that I said, but basically what happens is, yes, you will have findings coming out and it will end up informing classroom practices, at times policy changes, textbook rewriting or reforms, trainings being rewritten in the way they are conducted. So those all are the way systems can get influenced. I'll skip this. We'll come to the principles of assessment now before we move forward. So just again a question, because I want to make sure that in the absence of tea, we are not losing it. Any difference between an assessment that I do at the classroom level versus something that I do at the large scale level? Should there be any difference? Now I'm talking about assessment as a whole, not in terms of rigor only. Types of questions, should they be different? No? Okay. Any thoughts, anything? Yeah, right. Hmm. Can you please elaborate? Yeah. Yeah.
This is the whole idea. You have to look then because when I'm let's say when I'm taking a assessment of a kid, uh, I it does not give me a much space to reflect on my processes.
Right.
But a systematic assessment might give a larger understanding of my
Right.
processes, and then it
Yeah.
gives me
It will
a
have to
critical
give you in some way. Yeah.
critical,
ठीक
yeah.
है. Yes, please.
Large scale assessments. There's also the issue of analyzing that much data. So we might want to have lesser of the open ended questions because then it becomes easier to handle that much of data that's coming in.
Yeah.
Back after that to close the loop and then say what's my next step in terms of progress further in the year. It's easier again to do it in that setup given that I have to analyze a certain data.
Sure. So let's also first of all know all assessments have certain shortcomings. And when I talk of large scale assessments, I definitely have to compromise on free responses or open-ended questions, mainly because of the same reason. The scoring takes a lot of time. The scoring is extremely subjective there. Even if I have a rubric, I have like the audits and all will have to be very rigorous. The time it takes is very long, right? We'll talk about Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh does assessments for 40 lakh children every 3 months. Okay? And if we have open-ended questions there, then by the time the next assessments come, the results wouldn't have been out. So large-scale assessments may we make this room and we take it as a slight of a shortcoming and say the papers are, in 99% cases, the paper is only multiple choice questions. However, there are certain areas, certain cases where we would introduce one or two open-ended questions. So that's one difference that you will see. Other than that, second, when you analyze data, one data tells you whether the children knows the concept, the child knows the concept or doesn't know. But we don't want only that information. We also want to know if they do not know, what is it that requires to be corrected? Which is where multiple choice questions provide me 3 additional opportunities. One is correct answer, but 3 wrong answers for me to capture the possible existing misconceptions. That's another reason why MCQ questions are preferred. So rather than saying yes and no, now I have yes, no 1, no 2, no 3. And each one of those will have different classroom instruction reforms that can be carried out. Right? So those are a couple of them out of all the listed here. The basic purpose of large-scale assessment is to assess children at their grade level. We become slightly heartless. We don't really bother about the child having teacher, having school, having textbooks. No, doesn't matter. Because the purpose here is to actually find out if they are not having children. And I'll go back to an example. 10 years back, we did a large-scale assessment and we went back to schools just to understand, and there was one school which had 90% performance. And I went to the school with the hope that this must be the best of the school and children must be like studying all like fancy picture. I was also very new at EI, so I was like really away from the Indian reality of education system. I see that there's this one man who's cleaning the floor, and we introduce ourselves, and I'm my principal. And I'm the only one that we have in the school. School कहाँ है? पीछे है 2 classroom है. Grades कितने हैं? Grades 1 to 8. And who's teaching? No one's teaching. Because this principal can't teach. He went to get snacks and chai for us. Okay? So, and then we had to, rather than interacting with children, we educated him on why it was important for him to let his children fail in that test. Fail as in perform poorly. Because the purpose is to identify those gaps. Teachers नहीं हैं, school infrastructure नहीं है, students कम हैं, कोई subject में teachers नहीं है. All those things can come out only if you have poor scores. So the purpose is to identify systemic gaps and then feedback to go in the system to change it. And it has to be done in a timely manner, so multiple choice questions become a handy tool. अब तक सब everything's clear? ठीक है, अभी मैं थोड़े क्वेश्चन करूंगी, इधर आराम करूंगी, आपको सोचना है मेरे साथ साथ. Before that, we So we typically call question making an art and science both. Science because you require certain amount of technical subject knowledge to design a good question. Art because you will see some of the questions which we designed and those questions gloriously failed because we were being over intellectual about those questions. So art because you also have to think of how a child will interpret the question. And that's what we are going to look at. We've spoken about this enough, so I'm basically skipping this, but the idea is that depending on the assessment objective, depending on what I want out of those assessments, my assessment structure, broader framework, and the types of questions will get differently balanced out. Right? I want you to focus on the right-hand side of graph first before the question. And if you can see those graphs, typically, I'll just look at this way only, this is comfortable. So your x-axis is the actual grade level, which is grade 6, 7, 8, 9, and the y-axis is actual learning level. So a grade 8 child can be at grade 2 learning level 2. Each dot represents 100 children, okay? Each smaller dot. So if you look at grade 8 distribution, while ideally all children of grade 8 should be at grade 8 level, what you end up seeing is you see the amount of heterogeneity in the classroom, right? A lot of children are not even at grade 2 level. A good chunk of children are between, say, 3rd to 5th, right? And then I am going and saying, I will design a paper for you for grade 8, and I will give you feedback. And that's where I think what she was mentioning about scaffolding becomes important. So my assessment framework will have to have 50 to 60% items from that grade, but another 40 to 50% items at lower grades to identify what is the actual learning level of my system. Because I definitely for sure know that not all my grade 8 children are at grade 8, right? So this is coming out of actual research. So keeping that in mind, yes, again, assessment framework changes. Now I want you to look at the left-hand side question, and I want you to analyze it. So what do you like, dislike about question? The pie chart is the performance, green is the correct answer, red is the wrong answer. Yeah.
It's just that one shift in the centimeter is either you carefully look at it or mechanically just count the number and then not count, just see the number and mark the answer.
Okay, anything else? One is mechanical counting. Anything else that we observe?
Might be that the students have misinterpreted the length of the pencil from the point it's sharpened, I think, till the lead of the pencil.
That's also one part, and that's rightly thought. We encounter this, actually this question went through multiple cycles of revisions later on. This data is for this question, but we will see how this question evolved. Even the eraser that you have caused a lot of confusion at one point, so we'll discuss that also. But yes, other than that, if we consider that there is no sharpening and no eraser, so basically, we've all been taught wherever your object ends, that's the length you measure, right? We've never been actually explicitly explained, at least I wasn't. Yeah, yeah. So length is distance between 2 points. But because we generally focus on the last point and go down on the ruler and say, oh, 7, 6, oh, 5, we don't really focus whether it's distance that I'm measuring or counting that I'm doing. And moment you shift this pencil just by 1 centimeter here, the question's ability to capture misconception has gone really high, right? Otherwise, sabne sahi jawab diya hota because it's a very obvious, simple question. And our first question also had pencil from 0. We will see that as another example. But so basically the idea is this can help you identify misconception areas. And ये grade 5th के बच्चों ने around only 11% children answered this correctly, right? Ruler is actually introduced, I think, by 4th or so, or even before that शायद. But 4th से तो definitely they study. So just this shift, and there's a video that we will see also, how they arrive at their answers and what is the misconception there. Okay, I'm not going to discuss questions in specific here because these are subject questions that I've picked up from different grade subjects, but I will focus more on the qualities of multiple choice questions and why we prefer multiple choice questions. I think one, it makes it objective. When I have an open-ended question, every child can express his or herself in a different way. So for me to evaluate them becomes one, it's a longer process. Also, there is a lot of subjectivity involved. But when I have very specific options given, that ambiguity has gone, provided my options are not ambiguous. But with that, a good question, that becomes one good thing. If I really design my options very well, it also gives me strong misconceptions. That's another thing. You can in parallel read the question also, but yes, I'll just quickly move to the next. The problem with multiple choice question is it takes a lot of time. Okay, so when I started designing my papers during my academia previous avatar, the first MCQ paper was very quick. I did that in half an hour. Okay, question banao, there's one correct answer. There are 3 wrong answers. And then I realized those 3 wrong answers have to have some weight, but that took its own time for me also to know that. So now, in fact, at EI, we typically spend any number between 8 to 16 hours, all in all. It's like multiple questions are being made, but if you just average it out, per question, around 8 to 16 hours go in finalizing one question. Okay, and it starts with a good question idea, and someday if I get to show you our systems, there are questions where there are 52 back and forth on just one question, because the idea is powerful, but maybe the construction of questions is not good, maybe one of the distractors not standing out, and after 52 interactions between the creator and approver, the question gets finalized. So a good MCQ really is time consuming. That's the biggest challenge. Second challenge, it's not an item bank concept. I can't have one item and just tweak it around. So after a while, there is an idea exhaustion also, right? So I remember for our science group, we have a running Google sheet, and whoever's traveling, like someone, the other day someone was traveling by flight, and he must have kept his water bottle on the next seat, empty seat. And the flight took off and water moved in a certain way. He took picture, put that picture on the Google sheet, because then it can be used as a question. So it goes to that level of continuous idea searching, can be tiring. So all those things make questions difficult. Question ban bhi jaye, options bade difficult hote hain banana. Relevant options, that takes its own sweet time. And so one understanding about question is, अच्छा चलो twist करके पूछ लेते हैं, अच्छा चलो real life बना देते हैं. अब real life बनाने में we increase the context. The concept still remains simple, but the context is given so much. इसने 5 अंडे खाए, इसने 2 इडली खाया, जो भी, that actually does not change the rigor of the question. So it's just a reading comprehension question. Unless you have the PISA-like question where comprehension actually adds to your arriving at the correct answer, you're just making question unnecessarily difficult for children. So that's the third fear. And I will show you one example where we made it a weaker question and then we had to recreate it. Yeah. कभी-कभी एक ही चीज को, this happens in the initial time of question making, where you may just make question on anything and everything from the textbook. So ideally, when you even start making paper, you need to identify which are the skills that are worth testing. Not everything you teach is worth testing. There's a concept called understanding by design. And if you study, it's a big book also. There are videos also on YouTube. That sort of segregates topics into topics that are important to assess versus important to know versus just additional information. And making sure that your assessment only focuses on concepts important to assess, because आपके पास 200 pages की book के लिए 50 question है. In those 50-40 questions, you to assess the children for their mastery of the concepts. So you can't have just any random topic coming in as a question there. all the faida that you guys helped me arrive at. So all the advantages and disadvantages here. Just spend 5-10 seconds, then we move to the next one. We move forward. Up the pace is okay, everything's okay. Yeah. हाँ, अभी आप लोगों का काम है, इसका जवाब दे दीजिए. It's for me, right? Whatever you observe, अगर हाँ वो expression भी चलेगा. What's your problem with the question? हाँ. What's the correct answer according to you? 2 is the correct answer. अच्छा, ठीक है. Okay. हाँ, तो ये क्वेश्चन हमने हमारे दिमाग में बड़ा क्लियर था जब हम बना रहे थे. Okay, when we sort of shipped it out, so we do pilot of each question. When the pilots were done, we realized, so there, I've put one column extra, which is PBC. It's a parameter called point by serial coefficient. It's a data, I'll just quickly explain. So whenever a high ability child also does certain question wrong, the PBC is negative. So generally when you try to assess the quality of question, you go by positive PBC. If it is too positive, that means even your brighter children are interpreting that question that way. And most of the children had confusion because of the way the question was made. So the idea fell flat. हमने कुछ नहीं किया, we just revised this question. Now please try and answer. I mean read also and then. थोड़ा लेस कंफ्यूजिंग, क्लैरिटी है, अभी एक्सप्रेशंस नहीं बदले शायद, योर एक्सप्रेशंस डिडंट चेंज. So I think one is at times we believe बच्चों को नहीं आता, but when you go back and check your questions poorly designed, and it's the same idea, but the way it was written was so confusing that children, including all of us, including while I was putting this on the slide, I got confused कि मेरे को बोलना क्या है. Like it was simple yet too complicated an idea. Moment you just put it in bullets or something like that, segregate some information, the question becomes relevant. So the review of question goes to this level to understand, and that's why I think one is of course pilot that we do. इसमें कुछ प्रॉब्लम है तो बता दीजिए. प्रॉब्लम तो है ही, मैं बता देती हूँ क्या है, बता दीजिए. ज़्यादा मैथ्स है तो मैं पेपर लीक कर देती हूँ. So everything's okay in the question, सिर्फ वो R unit नहीं देना था. अब the brighter children will end up answering it correctly because they sort of also connect the dots and answer. But children who are struggling or learning the concept will have some problem. And that's where it's important that your question has every image labeled properly, every parameter of the question given, or else if we end up testing something wrong, we drop that question from analysis, because just because fewer children could answer does not make the question valid. So the PBC there becomes very relevant. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, yeah. So if there is a paper of 40 questions, so we don't go by children like child by child, but children who have scored, say, out of 40, they have 30, 35 correct answers, and their performance on this question versus children who have overall performance of, say, 10 correct out of 40, and their performance on that question. That is the coefficient that you take. So that's how you arrive at the answer. ठीक है. Last part is data. I think any assessment, and when I say this, I don't mean that revision assessments are not important. I'm more talking from the large scale assessments perspective. Any assessment that does not give you measurable data from large scale perspective is not really useful. If I'm a teacher teaching a class of 30, I don't really need numbers for everything because I know each of my child very well. And that's a very different scenario. I can do a simple revision test. I can just sit with a child, do 10 questions and understand. Those options are valid options. But when we are working at large scale, say with states or bigger organizations, measurable data, countable data becomes crucial for any assessment to become actionable. ठीक है, इसमें थोड़ा हम भागेंगे बिकॉज थोड़ा टाइम अपने पास नहीं है, पर ये मैम आपका प्रॉब्लम अभी आने वाला है. तो दिस इज द फर्स्ट क्वेश्चन वी डिजाइंड. ओके, एकदम टेक्स्ट बुक वाला बढ़िया, एवरीवन वुड आंसर इट करेक्टली. तो पता चला हाउ मेनी. वन, इट डज नॉट हैव ऑप्शंस. Second, it's very rote style of question. So most of the expected answer is going to be the right answer, right? No one's going to tell me 4 or 6 here because it's evidently just 5. So उसका थोड़ा better version बनाया कि चलो इसको shift करते हैं. तो the question that we discussed, it still does not have options. It's a better question than the previous one, but unless I have options, as an assessor, I will have to study each of the answer and then decide what is the percent misconception here. So the labor that goes in goes high. और आगे ले गए पेन. सिर्फ पेंसिल को ही हिलाना है, by the way, बहुत काम नहीं करना है. But why this worked, and that we will show in the video. So we tested the previous one with options and this one with options with children, and you should see what their answers were. We will go to that. And then there were people like you who realized that ये तो confusion करेगा. तो हमने बोला निकाल दो पेंसिल को और simple रखो and just try to see what's the exact object at which the child can answer. So some of these we discover after testing, some of these gets captured in pilot, some of this is actual evolution journey of question. So और आप जिन्होंने EI के presentations आगे attend किए, ये question हम हर बार use करते हैं. And like at times we feel, why are we using it for past 15 years? But even today, the performance on this question hasn't changed, by the way. Okay, this question is now out in public. हम इतने बार use कर चुके हैं. We've given it as an open source question for people to use it, but the performance hasn't changed, which also takes us back to Priyanka ma'am was talking yesterday about closing the feedback loop. The assessment के बाद क्या? That piece is still unclear. Yes.
So this pencil and scale is a very relevant example. My son is in grade 1. The same question has appeared in his paper, and he started basically measuring the pencil with the scale that he carry in the compost box.
Oh, अच्छा, the scale of
Although the scale has been given, but the dimension, the scale that was given on that is not matching with that scale. So he did not basically end up writing the answer because
he was confused.
He was confused what exactly needs to be written, and he basically made that statement to the teacher as well as me. So my question was, who is right in this particular
case? No, your son is right. Actually, the question maker should have put below the question that this image is not to scale. That's what we write generally.
Right. So normally
this is representative image. If that's not written, the question actually becomes invalid.
Right. So now he is in grade 1. His reading capability and understanding capability of that particular statement, which is given below, will be low.
Yeah. That's where technology will save us. We'll put voiceovers so that children can answer question by listening to it. That's something we'll discuss. But it's a valid concern, by the way, and that's why technology is probably some sort of solution. I don't know if the video will work.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
So you counted that and that's why you said that
Yeah.
it's 8?
Yeah.
And not because this point is 8?
No. This 4 will count as 1 and till 9 it will be 6. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll not see how much there is. Starts from 6 because it starts from 4, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Okay, so there's some voice issue here, but basically if I can just pause it, here the children are basically just counting and not measuring the distance, and they are missing out on 0. So they start from 1 because in their mind it's counting and that's what is coming out. And moment you asked, the part where the voice was not playing was when the person asked, what is the distance between these two? So for the first one, the distance was 0. That was child's answer. So 0 to 1 ka shift of measuring distance between 2 points hadn't happened. There are multiple slides on different misconceptions, but I want to focus time on AP, so I'm going to skip it. I'm sorry. We'll come back to this later. So I'll spend next 5 to 10 minutes on Andhra Pradesh. Sridhar had touched upon this yesterday. So there's a project in Andhra Pradesh titled as SALT, and it's actually playing the role of SALT only, making things interesting, supporting Andhra's learning transformation. And there are different partners in the project, LFE being one, focusing on mainly teacher training and other aspects. EI's focus is on assessment. So there are multiple partners with multiple responsibilities in their domains. And the SALT part, the assessment part is something that we are trying to look at. The basic idea is if we regularly do assessments, the summary of this slide, if I do assessments regularly, if I give feedback to the system regularly, and if that feedback actually feeds into the classroom practices, the assessment will change learning level. And while a third party can support for X number of years, we are signed up for 5 years, it is important that once the third party moves out of the state, the assessment culture continues. And to do that, it's important to create inbuilt capacities in the state to do better assessments, which is where they have also come up with state assessment cell. There are around 20 teachers there. Literally, they had to give interviews, exams, and on the basis of that, they were shortlisted. And they've been trained now for 3 years to design questions and assessments. They have come to around 70 to 80% question quality level as compared to our subject matter experts. So earlier when it started, when we were doing assessments, for the first 2.5 years, all the assessments were designed by our team. By then we trained these SSE members, and now the SSE members create papers, we review them. So I think the plan is to phase out, and by 5th year, we just become, we go with some snacks, sit and watch them work, basically review the process and ensure and sign off. But our role is more of phasing out so that they take the charge, and after us moving out, the culture of assessments with high rigor continues. So there are basically 2 things that we are trying to cover. Multiple aspects. One important aspect is also to ensure that whatever comes out of assessment every 3 months goes back into the system. So after every round of assessment, 40 lakh children take this, grades 1 to 8, all subjects. And then we create these misconceptions that we identified. We create small 1-pager posters. These posters also have classroom activities. And those are distributed to all, I think, 2 lakh teachers all in all. Grade-wise thode kam honge, but that's the total volume. Now that part we are not sure. We are not sure whether the teachers are really using those posters or not. That's still a gap at our end. We are not able to track it. We are trying multiple things. As of now, we don't have data on that. So that much part of feedback is not clear. However, when you do CBA, which is classroom-based assessments happening every quarter, there is improvement in learning. So there is something working, either the regular monitoring that is making them change, or there is actually feedbacking happening, or both to an extent happening. So that part is promising, but we don't have full clarity. So some details on classroom-based assessments, the subject tested. These are 20 marks, 20 question papers every quarter. There are 3 questions which are free response or open-ended. Rest of it is all MCQ. This is the question journey of a SSC cell question member, right? So if you see the first question, which just says identify compound word, and then the question that was created after, you can see the comments also. And on the basis of comments, then the question got revised and it came to this level. Within SSC also, within those 20 teachers also, you end up finding some are extremely good with subject knowledge, but not great with question making. Some are extremely good with question making if you give them ideas. So again, working out with state and identifying who's the one who will bring ideas and who's the one who will execute a nice question is the next stage of SSC profiling that we need to do. Question made by teachers used in CBA assessments, performance, and then them writing the misconception remedial. I mean, this only shows misconception, but also remedial activities that are created. So that feeds into then teacher's system. What we did, part of it, because we are not sure whether posters are really, really utilized, we have started partnering with LFE. Whenever the training manuals are being created, we put some of our misconception posters there, because in those trainings and discussions, these can then widely get discussed. So I think that's something that's happening. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly run through. These are misconception posters, some photographs from teacher training and teacher support. This is with the SCRT team and our team. CBAs are classroom-based assessments. These are formative assessments, and the process that it goes through is the top of the slide. Blueprint is created every time. Now SSC creates it. Questions are developed. Paper assembly happens. Questions and papers are reviewed. IPS is independent paper solving. So after everything is done, a person who's not at all involved in the paper will sit and solve the paper like a child. And that's where you capture all these chotu details, because then you move away from being a subject matter expert and try to think like a child. Okay, I'm going to quickly, these are the workshops that we did for SSC. So starting from item writing, which is question writing, to how to do data sampling, data analysis, and dissemination. We've covered all the workshops. We will need some refreshers though. Yeah, it's just a repeat slide. I'll just, This I think yesterday Sridhar had spoken, so I'll not speak much about it, but because we are talking about at scale, at least in Andhra Pradesh's case, what has worked well is, one, the state is extremely supportive. So all the CBAs, like I said, there is a considerable amount of investment being made from the state side, and we've not had any issues with that. So there is a lot of will to change, and that's helping. So the CBA assessments has been happening regularly. The most ideal form is when CBA is not controlled centrally, but is decentralized. But it has at least started. Assessment culture has to an extent set in. The state assessment cell, the teachers, 18 teachers, are 60 to 70% independent. There is still some work to do, but we are pretty confident that tomorrow, if we pull out of the project, they will be able to sustain the quality of the paper. So that's the level of confidence that we've got. And last slide, and I'll just leave it, but while things are happening well, and because we work with multiple states, we've not been able to create similar impact in other states, where we generally find it challenging to get support from the administrators or from SCRT heads, right? Because all of us have certain ideologies. At times, it's difficult to just do the initial advocacy part. I think what is working out very well in SALT project is there are 6, 7 different partners, each one hired for their expertise. So rather than one assessment partner also being, and doing the teacher training, which is really not their expertise, the smart thing is all the experts have been brought into one room. Quality, I generally believe for any assessment project, questions is the most fundamental thing to focus on. What I have not seen enough is the fourth point. Most of the states, including AP, does not have developed tech systems. So whatever is happening today and happening well may not last if they don't have these tracking mechanisms. That is a huge piece which is going to be a gap in future. And continuous communication ki isse bachchon ko asar nahi hoga, it's low stakes is something that can help. I am done. And I have 5 minutes to do question answers. Yeah. Yes.
How do we assess writing skills large scale?
Yeah, so what we generally do is we have these 2-3 items, and for those items we create rubrics. We take support from teachers. Teachers analyze it at their own speed, but we take 5% sample of that and also audit it. So just to make sure the quality is there. When you design the rubric, you make sure that your rubric talks of not just sentence construction or grammar, but also of idea of coherence, cohesiveness of text. So the rubric is जो scoring rubric होता है, that's around a 1-page long note. It's challenging at large scale though. We do it, but I think when technology comes in, it will be easier. Currently, it's a bit of a challenge.
So this was mostly about numeracy. What was the part about the literacy? I wanted to connect with this.
Assessments के लिए?
Yeah.
Same thing. MCQs. Typically 40 to 50% of paper is of unseen passages, unseen text. And you have reading comprehension questions on that. And 50% of questions are generally grammatical concepts covered at that grade level. So that balances out. Basically, so the approach that we take is we don't ask questions from the language textbook, because the idea is to have reading ability, comprehension ability. So we take grammatical concepts from the grade specificity, but all the text comes from unseen aspects. That's also a mix of it. So at higher grades, there is one story, one typically a newspaper article or a popular article with a lot of facts. One is a poster. It can be like Parle Ji ka poster also. But can children actually interpret that kind of cryptic information? And one can be poem. So we just mix it out, yeah. Yeah, and then yes.
So I saw that one of the workshop topics was administering the tests. So that's what I was curious about, because you make a great assessment, it'll check off all the boxes, but it needs to be administered properly.
Yes.
So from your experience at SALT, what are some of the challenges that teachers face in doing that, and how do we maybe support them, and what are some things about that?
Teachers tend to support children to score better. I don't want to call them, they help them with cheating, but the empathy goes wrong there. So we do audits, at least in 3 to 5% schools. We try and visit schools ourselves during the test, just to ensure that things are okay. So in terms of starting on time, ending on time, OMR ऐसे भरना है, वो सब everything's done well. When they are answering questions, we've also seen that teacher literally sits with 10 children, helps them write answers. And there was also one time when we were not allowed audit because of multiple political reasons, but also because it felt like we were too intrusive, both the cases. That's still a challenge. And the solution, long term, is to continuously tell them that this is not about children or about teachers. But it is going to take time.
So, I mean, with exams, our assessment is one part of it, what we're doing year on year, but 10th and 12th board exams are a big thing and a marker of, I mean, as an NGO, wherever we go, the question is 10th board result at score and how do you tackle that, and the conversation with administrators, with the bureaucracy, how is that different from your regular year?
So I think two things that we generally try and convince on. One of those is typically a successful selling point. One is if you start early, you have more number of years to bring your children to that level. That generally works. If that doesn't work, then you just flip it and say, make your board papers better, be ready to have lower results for 5 years, but over the next 5 years, then you will start see the change. The uptake more is for lower grades because states also in some ways compared for their board performances. So that becomes a challenge. There was a question by you and you, yeah.
So interleaving is not really something that happens very much during the one academic year, and very rarely it happens across academic years.
Yeah.
So when data or feedback goes back to the classroom or to the teacher to say that this was the misconception,
Yeah.
do you see it actually being utilized, or is it something that needs to be worked on at a system level? Because it's a linear progression during a year, so there's not much time to go back and reteach something.
Yes, so the CBA model is helping in that sense because every 3 months you get some time to work, which is at least 45 days, and it's not enough. But that's something that happens. But typically, which we didn't really highlight here, is also we do sample-based assessments as part of the project here. So that is every 2 years, and that feedback goes to multiple initiatives like how do you redesign your textbooks, how do you work on revamping the teacher training, and those aspects in the long run, if you continue that practice, CBA can give you on-the-go feedback. But in terms of changing the system, I wouldn't call interleaving, I mean, it still does not really feed into that aspect of it, but it gives system to be ready to ensure that there are lesser gaps. So that's how we.
I'm curious to know if any experiments have been done in the field of leveraging AI for the design of good assessments in two areas. One is in the design of assessments, and second is for evaluation of, say, response to an open-ended question.
So for second, yes, we are trying, at least for English and Hindi, we have started trying, English it works. Hindi, we are trying to see if we give them a typed essay, will it be able to interpret in a certain way, some amount of success, that work is going on. In terms of creating papers, as of now, no. But it's important, I mean, you can just train your model, it should be doable. We haven't yet started. We want to also use AI for there's an advanced concept called tech-enabled items, where the item does not have one right answer, so you move away from MCQs to multiple correct answers, where the system then analyzes what's the level of the child. That's one thing we want to work on. A bit of it is done, but long way to go. Yeah. So Parak will become slightly, perception will be a bit high stake for sure because of that. But I think somewhere it will be driven through, I'm not saying top down is the only right approach, but I think we've responded more to something that is measured and compared across. And that way, if we again focus on the quality of papers that Parak builds, maybe there is an answer. Yeah. Should we close? I'm done.